So now we're in Module 3, and we're going to go talk a little bit more detail about intellectual disabilities and their causes. We just, in Module 2, reviewed some of the biological, genetic, chromosomal influences, and now we're going to get into some outside influences, sometimes referred to as teratogens. Teratogens are any outside influence that harms the development of a fetus while in utero. And so let's talk about a few infectious diseases that might cause some of these intellectual disabilities. The first of those is toxoplasmosis, and the graph there on the right shows some of the possible causes of that. So toxoplasmosis is a protozoan infection contracted from ingesting infected raw meats or more commonly contact with infected cat feces. So if individuals, particularly pregnant mothers, have cats, they have to clean out their cat or kitty litter. They may get exposed to the toxoplasmosis and therefore get the protozoa, which can damage the developing fetus's brain development, resulting in an intellectual disability. You also have rubella, which is a viral infection, results in severe intellectual disabilities and possibly even death if contracted while the woman is pregnant. The good news is the vast majority of women will be immune from rubella because that is one of the vaccines that you get as a child in the MMR vaccine. It stands for measles, mumps, and rubella. If you have that, then you usually don't have to wonder if your child will have an intellectual disability due to rubella. You have the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, which can lead to AIDS. It can be transmitted from an infected mother to the fetus, and a third of the children who contact HIV or contract HIV prenatally do develop AIDS, and then there's also assorted intellectual dysfunction with that particular virus. The syphilis is a bacterial disease. Fortunately, we do have antibiotics that can help clear up syphilis, but if it is untreated, there's a number of physical and sensory handicaps that occur with the fetus, and that includes things like deafness, blindness, and certainly intellectual disability. If it happens very early in the pregnancy, it can even cause a spontaneous abortion. Genital herpes, this is a sexually transmitted disease, and it can be transmitted to the infant, particularly during the birth process. There's a lot of fluids involved, and if the genital herpes are active during the delivery, it's quite likely that the baby might get exposed to it and develop it. It can lead to some very serious problems, whereas an adult's genital herpes generally does not have dire consequences. It certainly can if you're an infant and receive it. So things like intellectual disability, but also blindness and maybe even death. Encephalitis and meningitis, both are infectious diseases that can occur after birth. Primarily during infancy, if you contract it, can cause the intellectual disability. Now, with encephalitis, this is an infection of the brain that produces inflammation and permanent damage in about 20% of cases. Meningitis, on the other hand, is an infection of the meninges, which are three main brains that line the brain overall. So it's kind of some of that protective covering. You got the skull, then you've got the meninges, and then you go ahead and have the rest of the brain. Inflammation of that lining is going to create intracranial pressure, and your brain does not like pressure. If you have too much pressure on the brain, it's going to result in brain damage and thereby interfering with your overall intellectual functioning. You can also see with meningitis neuromuscular problems, sensory impairments, in addition to the intellectual issues. Now, moving on into toxins, and one of the most frequent toxins that we're going to see is individuals who've been exposed to alcohol from their mother's drinking during their pregnancy. About 1 or 2 out of every 1,000 births is a child born with fetal alcohol syndrome. And what you see is that they have a slowed physical development, a smaller head, narrow eyes, various cardiac defects, and cognitive impairments. And as you can see here on the left is a child with fetal alcohol syndrome and some of the particular unique characteristics that we frequently see with an individual that has been exposed to high levels of alcohol during the pregnancy. And you can just spot them. They do not typically look like your typical child. You know that there is either a genetic or, in this case, a environmental toxin in the form of alcohol for this. Other types of toxins that we see in our environment, and this is not by any means a comprehensive list. Toxins are all around us, but we do know a few in particular that are very dangerous for a pregnant woman to be around. If you have any doubts, just go ahead and go shopping and look at the various foods, and a lot of them may have warnings for women if they're pregnant. So, for instance, mercury poisoning. What happens there is if a mother eats mercury during the fetus's development, what you begin to see is severe physical, emotional, and intellectual impairments. And they recently had a warning about women eating fish during pregnancy, especially deep water predator kind of fish, because they have high levels of mercury. Lead is another real danger. It produces a number of adverse behavioral and cognitive impairments, including intellectual disabilities. You might remember the not too long ago that Flint, Michigan had a real skyrocketing increase in the lead levels in children's blood, finding out that it was coming from the water they were drinking. And they are doing long-term studies of what that lead exposure does to those children's development. Now, all this being said, we need to remember that there is some normal gene variation. Anytime you have two adults get together and have a child, they're going to release a new child that shares a combination of their two genetic codes. And along the normal distribution that we talked about back in Module 1 with IQ, you're going to see a natural run kind of back and forth in regards to intellectual functioning. And that's just going to be a result of just your genetic influence. We know that the estimates are about 75% of the normal range of intelligence is attributable to genetics. And so a lot of times lower genetic potentials can run in families. It's also linked to issues such as poverty that can influence lower intellectual functioning, which is an interaction between genes and environment. What's referred to as a cultural familial intellectual disability. This is a case of where you may have families that have a little bit lower intellectual functioning, and their offspring then also have fairly low intellectual processing and functioning, but it may not be low enough to where we would call it an intellectual disability. That's where the social environmental factors can come in. So if you have somebody that's pegged pretty close to the line, let's say they would naturally have maybe about a 76, 78 IQ, a little bit above that cutoff, and they can function decently, but then you put them in an environment that has things like abuse and neglect or social deprivation, and you kind of dampen that potential to the below 70, and that's where a child might qualify for an intellectual disability, where genetically they maybe wouldn't quite do that. So what they refer to this kind of phenomenon is a reaction range. And this is a reaction range with children with Down syndrome, but you can see there's also this concept can play anywhere that you have. And so what you see is this genetics. The best way is if you go ahead and look at your intellectual potential. You have your genetics, which is kind of a nail in the board. This is what your usual environment genetic potential is. And the environment is kind of a rubber band that you can stretch either way. You have a impoverished environment, it's going to stretch you to the lower end of your intellectual potential. And if you have an enriched environment, it's going to stretch you towards the upper end of your intellectual potential. And as you can see there, the real impact of like an enhanced environment is if you have fairly low intellectual functioning, you can have some real gains, especially with the cultural familial intellectual disabilities that you see in the slide here. So I like this because I think it does a really good job of kind of explaining the interaction between genetics and the environment when we talk about things like intellectual disabilities, and that it isn't all just entirely genetic. So that's going to wrap up our causes of intellectual disabilities. And what we're going to start going over in Module 4 is looking at prevention and normalization of intellectual disabilities.